put the microphone away so it doesn't do that again. Follows along, I think, very nicely from the previous class. And if some of you weren't in Professor Ottison's class a few moments ago, I apologize for that. But I think you'll see where I'm going. So here's what I think we're used to when we think about Africa. These are just a couple of images, and I think they capture nicely three of the major concerns that we have about places that are poor. The general organizing theme for the talk might be something like Professor Ottison's class: why are some places wealthy and other places are poor? How can we understand these disparities? When we think about places that are very poor, we do oftentimes think about Africa, and we think about some of these outcomes of poverty or some of these manifestations of poverty. We think about conflict, for example. Africa is a continent where there's been a lot of conflict over the past 30 years, and conflict tends to retard economic growth and tends to create situations in which people have a hard time overcoming poverty. When people have a hard time overcoming poverty, when they're living in poverty, they live in these kinds of environments. This is an informal settlement in Africa. Informal settlements look a lot like this. Actually, this one has some advantages over some others that I've been in. But these are places where people live in very tight quarters if they're in urban areas with garbage around. Lack of sanitation creates all sorts of problems. And what are some of the problems going to lead to? They're going to lead to situations where children are malnourished, where they're stunted, where they don't grow the way that we would like to see them grow. So this is how we think, many Americans anyway, about Africa. But how do we understand why that continent has suffered in ways that other places haven't? And so for those of you who were in Professor Ottison's class, you've talked about some of the theories, some of the reasons behind Africa's poverty or Latin America's poverty or South Asia's poverty. Some people have suggested over the course of the past 60 years that really the reason that poor countries are poor is because they lack capital. They don't have money. They don't have capital. That means there isn't capital available to be invested because there's not capital available in a domestic economy to be invested. Businesses don't grow. You don't get the growth that's generated by the private sector. So people enter into a kind of vicious cycle of poverty that they can't break out of unless there are injections of capital coming from outside the system. So that could be through vehicles like foreign aid. It could be through vehicles like foreign direct investment. But one reason why countries might be poor is because there is a lack of capital. It might also be that there's a lack of technology. For whatever reason, there hasn't been an influx of the kinds of technology that increase productivity of workers. And so countries aren't able to compete with other economies, with other countries around the world. And so they stay poor and they're not able to ever catch up. You'll know that some people, maybe most famously among economists anyway, Jeffrey Sachs argues that the reason why some countries are poor and other countries are wealthy is because they've lost the geographical lottery. They're stuck in lousy places where mostly, the lousy places are places where it's hot, where there's disease, or maybe they're mountainous countries that are far from ports. So these may be factors that are contributing to poverty in some countries. What about demography? It might be in a case of a country like India or China. Well, they may be poor because, wow, there are just too many people. And too many people create a kind of drag on a society. And rather than seeing people as an ultimate resource, people are seen as a kind of problem, a kind of cost to be overcome. And so maybe in countries where there are very high birth rates, high costs associated maybe with health concerns, maybe this is an explanation for why countries are poor. What about the environment? Some people might say the reason why countries are poor, some countries are poor and other countries are wealthy, is because some countries are poorly endowed in terms of environmental resources. Maybe they don't have a lot of mineral wealth, maybe they don't have good ports, maybe they don't have the sorts of things that we've used in the developed world to help promote our growth. And there could be other issues. I mean, sometimes people talk about cultural issues, for example. Maybe in some countries there's a kind of culture that either makes it difficult for people to succeed economically or that almost penalizes economic success. And here's how I've heard this argument made in Africa. Some people in Africa will say, well, I really don't have a good incentive to become a successful entrepreneur because if I do become a successful entrepreneur, I'll suddenly be responsible not only for myself and my immediate family, I'll be responsible for my cousins and my cousins' cousins, and Everyone who has any sort of even slight connection to me will be writing to me or will be calling me or will be texting me and saying, send money, my child can't go to school. Send money, my child needs to go to the medical clinic. And so a successful entrepreneur in effect becomes the social security network for everyone who has a connection for him or her. And that can be a kind of a disincentive to generate wealth or be a successful entrepreneur. So those are some of the reasons that might contribute to understanding why some countries are wealthy when other countries are poor. But actually, I think this is a much better and a much stronger explanation. So why is it that some countries are wealthy and other countries are poor? I think a lot of the explanation rests on whether or not there's a supportive environment at the national domestic level to promote productive entrepreneurship rather than wealth predation. So if you have a society that encourages wealth creation broadly across all levels of society, not just at the elite level, but among people at the bottom of the income distribution as well, if you have a society that encourages wealth creation and isn't really facilitating wealth predation, particularly wealth predation by the people who are running the government, then you tend to have a society that's going to experience economic growth. Might be low levels of economic growth at first, but over time, as we know in the United States, low levels of economic growth compound, and you get to a situation where a country can become much wealthier. So what's a supportive environment look like? You've probably read books that say, well, it's the institutions that matter, but which institutions? It's a fair thing to say that actually people who work in the development area will oftentimes say two kind of contradictory things. We'll oftentimes say, A, there's no recipe for wealth. There's no recipe to solve the problem of poverty. People like Jeffrey Sachs actually do believe there is a recipe to solve the problem of poverty, interestingly. But at the same time, we'll say, well, but we know what's important. So what do we mean by those two different things? Well, we might say there's no recipe to create wealth. In other words, there's no one blueprint that's going to work the same way in every country to promote wealth creation. And yet we know that there are certain necessary conditions that have to exist on the ground in order for a society and the people in the society to thrive. What are some of those necessary conditions? There has to be a support. There has to be some way that the national government is supporting positive entrepreneurship, again, non-predatory entrepreneurship. I guess I should probably stop and say, the term entrepreneurship is used very broadly today, and I'm actually going to be using it very broadly. So we talk about a lot of different kinds of entrepreneurs now. I'll be talking about policy entrepreneurs, I'll be talking about social entrepreneurs, I'll be talking about traditional entrepreneurs during the course of my talk. Supporting positive entrepreneurship means supporting people who are not engaged in a negative-sum game within their society. In other words, they're not trying to suck wealth out of the system for their own personal benefit exclusively. They're not trying to maybe game a system so that they win and nobody else wins. Positive entrepreneurship means people are doing things like either meeting consumer demands on a voluntary basis, which is what traditional entrepreneurs do, or a policy entrepreneur might be creating an enabling environment. This is the way development people talk about this. A social entrepreneur is meeting some kind of another need within a society. And those are important folks to have working within a society. Here's probably the most important issue that I see every time I visit Africa: a need to increase security and lessen predation from the public sector and from the private sector. There's predation that comes from both groups. Public sector predation is in the form of corruption. Private sector predation could be things like just everyday normal thievery, or it could be people who are able to take advantage of the public sector in order to get sort of monopoly benefits. Increasing security, improving governance, improving the rule of law is the key element. It's like the foundation upon which economic growth takes place. That's one of the important steps, one of the important necessary steps to wealth creation, creating a society that's well-governed in which there's a respected rule of law. What else do you have to allow for to have wealth creation? People have to have some freedom. They have to have some freedom to experiment. They have to have some freedom to fail. Entrepreneurs are constantly trying. I mean, this is the great thing about entrepreneurs, and probably some of you are already entrepreneurs. You probably have entrepreneurs in your family. What is it that's so interesting about entrepreneurs? They're always looking for ways to do more, do it better, do it with less, innovate, 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 in order to meet consumer demands, because if they don't meet consumer demands, they're not going to be there tomorrow because someone else will step in and meet those demands. Why? In our society, it's because they have the freedom to do all that. They have the freedom to innovate, to try, to fail. If they fail, they know they can usually start again. And the thing about American entrepreneurs is that they do tend to be serial. They start one business, it might fail, they start another one. Having a scope for personal freedom to try experiments is very important for creating a supportive environment. So how might an environment not promote this kind of individual freedom and exploration? What if you have a society with no bankruptcy law? What if you have a society in which it's really costly to close a business? Maybe you have to give every worker in the society, if you have a formal sector business, 2 years termination before you can fire them. You don't get as much innovation in a society like that because failure becomes so costly that people aren't willing to risk what's involved in starting a new business. But if you have a society that allows for this kind of freedom experimentation, that provides security, then you tend to get entrepreneurs doing very interesting things to solve problems of poverty. So I mentioned briefly I'm going to be talking about 3 different kinds of entrepreneurs. My sense after doing a fair amount of work now in Africa is that you need all 3 of these folks working to fix the problem of poverty on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa. All 3 of these groups are really, really important. Unfortunately, the first group is very hard to get. It's very hard to identify examples of successful policy entrepreneurship in sub-Saharan Africa for precisely the reason that we heard in the video that Professor Otteson showed earlier. People who are elites, political elites in a government, are usually benefiting from the status quo. The status quo is there for a reason. It's because somebody, some group, is benefiting from it being that way. If no one was benefiting from a suboptimal status quo, people would be trying to change it. So if an economy is sort of not functioning, if it's not working well for folks on the ground, it's probably the case that someone has control over parts of the economy and they're benefiting, even if the average taxpayer, the average citizen, the average consumer is not benefiting. So finding examples of positive policy entrepreneurship, shedding some light on those examples, encouraging more policy entrepreneurship, I think is a really important thing to do when it comes to Africa and other parts of the developing world. Traditional entrepreneurs we know all about. They're around us all the time. They're the people who are building businesses. What are they doing when they're building businesses? They're identifying needs within their communities, or they're identifying needs that may be met outside their communities. But they're sort of, in an Austrian economic sense, they're alert to some possibilities to pursue a profit opportunity, and they take on the risks that are associated with trying to capture those profits. But they are meeting consumer needs, and they're doing it. They have to do it in a voluntary way in order to succeed. Social entrepreneurs. I don't know how many of you guys are interested in social entrepreneurship, but this is a growing, interesting field. The sort of people who become social entrepreneurs in the U.S. tend to be the folks who go to MBA programs, but kind of feel guilty about going, to work for Wall Street afterwards because they want to do something to help the world, and so they become social entrepreneurs. So they work for businesses that are meeting a need on the ground, so they feel better about contributing to the good of the world. But the business that they're part of needs to make a profit in order to be sustainable. So it's an interesting combination of nonprofit, for-profit business model. Lots of social entrepreneurship going on in the world today. I actually serve on the board of a small social enterprise. I love working with them, and I think the mission that we do is really important. And I think the mission that we do oftentimes as social entrepreneurs is fill a gap when a government can't do something. So we're almost filling a public sector need. And so what social entrepreneurs do a lot of is provide educational training, provide skills training, provide medical care, meet the sorts of needs that we expect in the developed world the governments to do, but that governments in the developing world just aren't capable of doing for a variety of reasons. Okay, so